Man, I hate my skinny wrist. But is there any way to increase your wrist size by 1 inch or maybe even 2 inches? Yes, I do have a solution for you. By arm wrestling, you can easily increase your wrist size by 1 or maybe even 2 inches. That is total bullshit, man. Wrist size is genetics. You cannot change your genetics. But haven't you heard that Ryan Bowen and Michael Todd increased their wrist size by nearly 2 inches just by arm wrestling? Yes, but those guys are on steroids. Abs on a skinny guy, boobs on a fat girl, and gains on a juiced up guy doesn't count. But those guys also swear that they increased their wrist size even before they were on PEDs and significant gain. Nah, I don't agree with you. You don't have to. You guys just go away. Let me talk to the experts. Welcome, arm wrestling fans. I'm Pradeep from Arm Wrestling News, and today we will be calling three experts to weigh in their opinions about this interesting topic. Number one is going to be Ryan Blue Bowen, the guy who self admittedly increased his wrist size by more than 1.5 inches over a period of 8 years just by arm wrestling training. And number two is going to be Rob Vigent Jr. Rob has been arm wrestling for nearly 2 decades now, and he believes that Ryan is total bullshit and he has those gains just because of steroids. And number three is going to be Leo from Leo and Longevity. Leo is someone who does arm wrestling training, bodybuilding training, reads a lot of books, and does a ton of research on these topics. So he is going to be our expert today. So sit back and enjoy this video and subscribe to our guests as well. Links will be in the description. So welcome to the show, Ryan. How are you?
I'm well, man. Thanks for having me on, as always.
Yeah, I've briefly explained the topic to our viewers today. So I want to ask you, what were you trying to say that day on Neil Pickup Show when RVJ didn't let you speak?
Oh man, I'm just trying to say that my wrist has grown substantially during my time in the sport. I started in 2013, and the story goes I had a metal clasp watch, so I know that watch hasn't stretched or anything, and it was about probably 5 years into the sport that I went to put on that metal clasp watch, and it was impossible to close. Like, it wasn't even close, and I was like, wow, look at that! Look at how much my wrist has changed. And at that time, about 5 years in, I had about an inch growth in my wrist when I measured it. Because I went out there and straight away measured the internal circumference of the watch when it was done up, and it was like 7.5 inches. And so 7.5 inches used to be my watch, and then 5 years in, it was impossible. And I measured it, and I was at like 8.25 at the time. And now I'm on my right hand, which is my hand that is the working hand. If I'm pumped up, I'm like just shy of 9 inches. If I'm right on the bone, if I go where my wristwatch used to sit, I'm 9 inches. And on my left arm, where my wrist watch used to sit, I'm 8.5 inches. So I've gone up a full inch on my left, and I'm assuming my right was the same as my left before arm wrestling. So I've gone up 1.5 inches on my right. Is what's happened to me. And I know that Rob on that argument was wanting to say it's all the steroids, it's all the HGH that you've been taking forever, Ryan. First of all, I took none of that prior to 2019. And like I said, I noticed this about 5 years into the sport. I've also had lots of people within the arm wrestling world, because I've had this discussion a few times over the years. A lot of people who were skeptical about it at first have actually come back to me years later and said, hey, you know what? I've been arm wrestling now for 1.5 years, 2 years, and I've put on 1 inch in my wrists. And so it very clearly happens. And I think, first of all, I think there's a couple of things that Rob may or may not be missing. I'll give a little bit more credit. If you measure right on the wrist bone, it's going to have less of a factor. I was always measuring where my wristwatch sat. And there's a lot of soft tissue there. At the end of the day, there's a lot of soft tissue right here that clearly grows. You can see I can flex those damn muscles, and they're very relevant to arm wrestling. So they are going to expand as you become a seasoned arm wrestler. The other things that I think Rob's missing is, I actually think bones actually do change as well, even the bones themselves. And as you would, I think you showed me, we talked about, they call it Wolf's Law.
Right.
And you can look at that you can look at Wolf's Law in many respects. Just look at a farmer. My dad's a farmer, was a farmer for a long time. The bones in his hands are thick, and they weren't like that at the beginning of his farmer journey. And my dad has no performance enhancing drug history and ever. There's no reason for a farmer to go out and take steroids or HGH or anything. And yet his hands have grown. And that's a very common thing amongst farmers, amongst tradesmen, amongst anyone who's doing a manual labor. I know you can look back. I remember when I was in ancient history class in high school, looking at archers who used to ride horses on wooden saddles, and their hips had changed shape and thickened in the bones because they were getting repetitive stress against a wooden saddle. So bones change, and there's clearly a lot of repetitive stress in arm wrestling. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if bone densities did change. Wouldn't be huge amounts, but it would be enough to be noticed, I think, under scans. But bottom line is soft tissue at the line where the wrist is huge. And I know Rob's going to quote, I think it was Mazel Jador from Canada. He said that when he got off steroids, he lost an inch off his wrist. And Rob was going, yeah, look at this. This guy's my favorite quote ever. And my answer to that is water weight and all that sort of stuff. It just reiterates my point that at the wrist line, at the wristwatch mark, there's a lot of soft tissue. And when you're on gear, you'll have water retention. When you're a heavier human, you'll have water retention. And yes, that will inflate numbers. So getting off gear, imagine it's fair to assume that when you get off gear and that water retention in your body, a lot of steroids will increase your body weight 5%, maybe even 10%. And so naturally, that's going to, when someone gets off gear and the water retention goes down, they're going to lose measurement in the wrist as well. My wrist, as I said, right now, just shy of 9 inches at the wristwatch line, undeniably has grown over the years. And prior to me ever having touched steroids in my life, which was in 2019, that began, there was heaps of growth already. It was already at 1.2 inches or something like that. And yeah, that's my point, basically wrapped up.
Yeah. And we just need to look at the older generation. From where I come, the state of Haryana, a lot of women do physical work still. So they go to farms, they like agricultural work, everything. And when we look at the women in my state, who are about 60, 70 years old now, almost all of them have thicker fingers than me. Women, I'm not even talking about men. So it definitely has to do something. You don't even have to be a manual labor, because about 30, 40 years ago, almost every work was manual. Nobody was working from home back then. So you had to move your hands and legs to earn a living. So that is why all the older generation, almost every time, has a thicker hand than the newer generations.
All right. So one other factor, Pradeep, is my left and right wrist. Now, this will trump Rob's argument of that it's all steroids that did this in me, because my left wrist is significantly smaller than my right wrist, despite them being the same before I started arm wrestling. Now, that can only be attributed, therefore, to the work done on my right arm. And everyone who knows that has followed my journey, I only train my right arm, or at least 95% of my training time goes into my right arm. So why is my right wrist, Rob, so much bigger than my left wrist? If it was just the drugs that were doing it, it would have come up equally. But the fact of the matter is my right wrist is significantly bigger than my left. And that, to me, the answer is it is clearly attributed to the work done and subsequently the soft tissue development, the growth, the bone density increase, whatever you want to call it. But my left wrist, once upon a time, was as big as my right. Now it's way behind. There's nothing I can say that wouldn't be taken as a moment or an opportunity for conflict for RVJ. It doesn't matter. Somebody else will say this and he'll agree with them, but because I'm saying it, he'll jump up and down. But anyway, I do think you're a fool on this one, RVJ, because there's a million pieces of, sure, there might be anecdotal evidence, but there's anecdotal evidence freaking everywhere that wrists grow. So I'll see you next time we do, Rob. Yeah. And right, everyone else, you guys know it. You guys know that the wrists grow.
And now thanks, I am a study subject. I promise you, I'll train hard for next 1 or 2 years and see how it goes.
Beautiful.
All
Beautiful.
Right,
what is your wrist measure right now?
I'll tell you, maybe somewhere around 7 inch. I don't think it is even 7 inches. I'm talking about here.
Right on there.
Yeah.
Okay. Do them both. Measure there for me and measure the wristwatch as well. So we got both.
And one more
Yeah.
thing about it, I actually did a poll on this. So the poll was, has your wrist grown more than 2 centimeters since you started arm wrestling? And in that poll, about 19% said that yes, 30% no, and 51% never measured.
I would say 100% of arm wrestlers, if you have been consistent in arm wrestling, again, it depends where we're measuring. If we're measuring right on the bone, it's reasonable to think that there wouldn't be many changes in the majority of people unless they're really serious. But even right on the bone, you can flex your thumb and it flares out a tendon. It's going to have an effect as that tendon thickens, and all the tendons in your hand are going to thicken. So I would say 100%, if we're measuring here where the wristwatch sits, 100% of people actively involved in arm wrestling would have a bigger wrist. Like as I hold onto this part of my wrist and I just do this with my hand, the amount of soft tissue I can feel flexing, it's huge. It's extensors, it's both sides of the hand and wrist. There's a lot going on there. And arm wrestlers, that's their prime real estate. So 100%. I would be absolutely certain that 100% of people have increased their wrist size who are active in arm wrestling.
I think when I'm asking people about their wrist size, because wrist flexion, this is called wrist flexion. So I assume that they're talking about this point right at the joint and not about half an inch or inch below. So my question is, if you were still natty even now, if your wrist has grown 1.5 inches, would you say that it wouldn't have been that much of a gain if you were natty still now? So how was your gain till 2014 to 2019 and after that?
Well, like I said, when I first realized that my wrist had gotten substantially bigger was probably 5 years into the sport. So about 2018, when I realized, oh, wow, this wristwatch does not even come close to fitting me anymore. And I know Jordan Davis is another great case study. Jordan will say, like when Jordan started the sport, he was a phenomenally skinny person. He famously could reach around his forearm and touch his fingers. I know he's got very long fingers, but he could touch his finger and his thumb around his forearm. Now he can't touch his finger and thumb around his wrist. And Jordan's a natural athlete. Jordan hasn't done anything, and that is a huge piece of evidence. And I know, like I said, for me, I noticed it, and I had my right wrist had gained about an inch at the wristwatch level. I didn't measure specifically at the joint, so I can't tell you the data. I just don't know the data on my wrist at the joint. But at the wristwatch level, an inch in the first 5 years, and now I'm at about 1.5 inches, being 9 years in.
All right, Dan. So I'm someone who has the skinniest wrists in the world. What would Ryan Bowen suggest Pradeep Singh from Arm Wrestling News to do over next 1 year to increase my wrist size by 2 centimeters?
Well, please do measure your wrist now. And I would just say just arm wrestle. You don't need to do. I've never. People have asked me in the past before, how do you increase your wrist size? And I say, I don't know. I've never looked to specifically pursue a thicker wrist. I have always been obsessed with. I remember when I first started arm wrestling, I'd call it. You'd look at the solidness of the meat bag of someone's forearm. I remember seeing Travis Bagent and seeing how thick it was right up to his wrist, where bodybuilders and people that aren't arm wrestlers, it's still thin up here and it's all down low that their thickness is. And so using your hands in a combination of wrist flexion and pronation and just all things arm wrestling at the end of the day, I think will thicken, will send that muscular development, the hypertrophy right up into the wrist. And naturally the tendons are going to become more resilient and everything. So just arm wrestle. If you arm wrestle 3 times a week, plus you do basic training, low to mid-level effort every day, I would put $100 on it right now that in a year's time, you've put on an inch in your wrist.
That's amazing, man.
Well, you got to put the work. You got to put the work in, Pradeep. You got to put
Definitely.
the work in.
I'll keep giving you feedback. Welcome to the Video Arm Wrestling fans and Rob Vision Jr. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I want to talk about the conversation. And before that, guys, we are not having this conversation because we have settled our unnecessary online internet beef. We are having this conversation because maybe we want to settle it. So Rob, what was your conversation on that Neil Pickups live stream when Ryan Bowen was saying that he grew his wrist by 1.5 inches and you were saying that it is not possible?
Well, I mean, it is possible, but it's not possible in the way that he says it. So it's like when you see those magazines that tell you how a movie star gained like 30 pounds of muscle in like a month for a movie role. And they say, look at the workout plan, look at the meal plan, but they're leaving out the biggest pieces. So I said, I don't buy it that it grew an inch and a half, and you can't naturally do that. It doesn't grow like that, because I myself, as a natural athlete, also my whole life did strenuous jobs that required a lot of swinging hammers, a lot of squeezing things, a lot of picking up heavy stuff. And then I went into grip sport, which is squeezing, bending all day long. And then now I'm almost 2 decades deep into arm wrestling. And as a hand control guy, I probably focus on my hands and wrists more than other guys. So you're talking 30 years of cumulative real world stuff. And my wrist probably has changed a quarter of an inch since I was in my late teens. So unless he's got something different with his DNA or a tumor on his pituitary gland, I'm not buying it that he's leaving out a big piece of the lie.
So since you mentioned physical work, obviously I've not done any manual work of the sort that you are talking about, so I could only guess about it. So my guess would be that kind of work is heavy, more on the fingers and less on the wrist, isn't it? Like the manual type of work you're talking about.
No, it depends on what you do. It like all those trades have different things. If you're swinging a heavy hammer, it could be very heavy on your wrist. If you're troweling, things like when you do like drywall, or if you're troweling masonry, it could be very heavy on your wrist. I mean, your hand and wrist, it's hard to isolate them by themselves when it comes to moving things like lumber. If your wrist is limp, your tools are going to be flying around all over the place. They really work in conjunction. So when you do it's not just in the trades that I work in, you don't just have one facet where you just swing a hammer all day. You might be cutting with a big saw, you might be carrying lumber. The fact of the matter is your hands and wrists get incredible work all day. And then when you talk about going to a gym and specializing on hand and wrist strength, there's nothing in there to grow. It's bones and tendons and veins and stuff. It doesn't, hypertrophy.
So
your bones grow from when you're a kid to an adult.
Right. I'm kind of between you and Ryan in this argument. Once there was a post on Facebook group, and it was either about Michael Todd or about Ryan Bowen. And under that post, one guy commented that I do not have trust and faith in these guys anymore. I did not know that he was on steroids. So I replied to his comment that, so you do believe it when people say that they grew their wrist 1.5 inches just by arm wrestling. So I'm also not a believer in increasing your wrist size by 1.5 inches. So what was the argument? Are you saying that you just cannot grow it, or you are saying that you cannot grow it by 1.5 inches?
Growing it would be marginal, like maybe marginal thickness, but some of that could just be getting older. My wrist grew maybe a quarter of an inch since like being 20 years old. And that's with doing all the right things. And now you're talking about a guy growing over 20% in what, like a couple of years, a year and a half, 2 years? No, I don't think that's possible unless you're taking like lots of growth hormone. People will talk about like Dennis Cyplykov's bone structure, but a lot of that's manufactured too. Is it possible? Yes, it's also possible to make yourself taller if you want to go get a surgery and extend your chins, but it's not possible to do just by exercises and stuff. It's really not. So do I believe it? No. If that's the case, then how come all the arm wrestlers aren't walking around with 9 and 10 inch wrists? Does Ryan Bowen have more time invested on a table than John Brzezinski, who's been doing it 40 years? Why does John Brzezinski have the same wrist size as me? Riddle me that. Why do guys who've been doing it for 40 years plus, they don't all have like 9 and 10, 11 inch wrists? If you can continually make it grow through stress and putting it under workload and stress, why is Ryan the only one who's getting that kind of gain? And all these guys have been arm wrestling 2, 3, 4, 5 times longer than him, don't have that gain at all. Is he a physiological next level like an X-Man? No, there's something missing to that story.
About I would say 4 or 5 years ago, I used to do some study about this bone structure or skeleton structure of a human being. And I read a few articles. They used to say that human skeleton, they were specifically talking about this rib cage. It can expand up to age of 30 years or maybe even 35 years in some cases. So could that wrist gain be during that age, 30 to 35 years? Maybe after that, arm wrestlers stop growing like their. And how would you explain that older generations almost always have thicker hands and thicker wrists, thicker fingers than the younger generations?
Yeah, I mean, so as far as the chest expansion, that's something that happens. You're talking something that's the size of it's carrying all your organs and your whole body and whatnot. So it's not the same as a joint. I mean, it's always expanding and moving anyways. And it's a common thing with a lot of older guys. They get what's called like a barrel chest. They just get a little bit bigger through here, even in their structure. That I don't know how that happens or why, but it's very different than just something that's like a straight bone. Because if you think about it, if you want to talk about a joint that takes a lot of abuse every single day from every person that can walk, think about how much abuse your ankle takes walking around and carrying your whole body weight all day. And look at why aren't marathoners, people who run marathons and they got all those tendons and all that bone there, they're bouncing for 20, 30, 40, 100 miles at a time every day. Why aren't their ankles this thick? So why do the older generations have thicker hands? Maybe it's just like the tissue in their hands from a lot of abuse, and it's thicker, but like marginally. It's so it could be due to their life, their work. I don't know, but it's not. Inch and a half on something that small is, you're talking over 20%. That's a dramatic increase. That's dramatic.
So I'll give you one example. About 6 years ago, I would say, I was doing parade. So on the right arm, we have to hold a rifle about 4 kg in weight for almost 2 hours. Hold it with the grip. And then I measured, I saw significant pump in my right arm, even near the wrist. And next day I compared it. I measured it. And after 2 hours of just holding rifle, it like this area was taken by almost 1 centimeter, about 1 centimeter, but it went away immediately. That pump went away immediately in like 1 hour after that, or maybe 30 minutes after that. So I would say there are some muscles or tendons, because wrists can even wrists can get pumped. I have seen that physically just with holding a
Right.
rifle for 2 hours.
But you're talking 1 centimeter. How big is 1 centimeter? You're talking that's, this big. How many centimeters are an inch and a half? Like 37?
3.5 maybe.
No. Oh, I'm thinking of millimeters. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Three and a half. Okay. So 3.5 centimeters. Still, you're talking of growth, and you're talking on a person like that's a new load to you, and it can get pumped, but you said it goes away.
Yeah.
Now you're talking Ryan Bowen was already very hardcore, very much in like entrenched in the working out and arm wrestling game. And then all of a sudden, it wasn't like it grew period. He had a stretch of growth that was just like bang. And I just think it's a lot of misinformation, because when you start saying these things to people out there who don't know any better, that look on YouTube to find information, they then start looking at some of these lifts or some of these gains. And if they're not getting them without understanding all the parameters, they think they're doing something wrong. And then they get like upset or deflated. And the thing, a thick wrist doesn't even mean it's a strong wrist. I've known guys that have had natural 10-inch wrists and they couldn't keep their wrist from getting folded back, but they just had a big joint there. But there's just misinformation. And I think that until you are clear that, yeah, hey, like I'm going to own it. Yeah, I did growth hormone and my wrist grew incredibly. Everything grew. My hand grew, my wrist grew, everything grew. Okay, that I believe. Don't sit there and say it's just because you worked harder. That bothers me.
And I heard once on Leo's channel, Leo also mentioned that even testosterone use over a prolonged period of time can thicken your bones, even testosterone. So not only HGH.
Right. No, and I mean, I'm sure it's just to what level. It's to what, because like I said, I don't think that testosterone is anything that's hard to find usage and abusage of within day-to-day life or our sport. And if that was the case, everyone that's been doing it longer than Ryan Bowen would have much bigger risks, or, everybody would have that level of gain. That would be the standard. People do testosterone and trend and all that, and they get big traps and big shoulders and stuff, those are cues you can see. And if just getting big wrists on all these arm wrestlers who do this all day, every day, why isn't the new standard like a 9 and 10 inch wrist? Why are we still seeing guys with 6.5, 7 inch wrists? It's weird. And so I just think it's almost like, I don't know if he's using it like a badge of honor, like his wrists are so big now, but all I see is, you're leaving out a big part of the story that makes the story, which is the why.
Yeah. When you mentioned 6.5, 7 inch wrists, I feel like you were talking about me, because my skinny wrists could be one of the biggest motivating factors for me. If arm wrestling can actually grow your wrists, then it is a big enough motivating factor for me to start training. It is big. It will be bigger than winning medals and winning state championships, winning all of that. So I will really try to do hardcore arm wrestling training for next couple of years, and let's see if that works out. So RVJ, that's all I wanted to discuss with you on this. If anything that you want to add.
No, and I mean, as far as you say thickening your wrists, I don't think your wrists are considered small. I think if you look at like what the standard is for wrist sizes for watches and bracelets and things like that, I think that when you go on the internet and look up any measurements, everyone's small. I'm small. You could be 6'2" and 220 pounds, great size for the NFL, but somewhere in the world of arm wrestling, you're a little guy. So when you look on the internet, everything's small, everything's below average. A guy who might never have done manual labor, you might gain something. You might get something there from the tendons getting thicker and even the bones getting a little denser. Heavy lifting does that. If you come back and say you did 1.5 inch gains, I'll be floored. If in 3 years from now we revisit this and you've got a 9-inch wrist or 8.5-inch wrist, that'll be something to hear. But no, it's all good. So I said my piece on that and I stand with it because, like I said, I just want information to be clear.
Hello Pradeep, thank you so much for your question. First of all, it is known from experience that powerlifters, grip enthusiasts, and arm wrestlers have experienced an increase in the diameter of their wrists over time. I found this to be the case myself. In high school, I had one of the smallest wrist sizes of men in my grade. In fact, it was certainly the smallest among my friends group and maybe the smallest overall in the grade. I had large hands and a small diameter. The diameter of the wrist now has increased by about 1 inch, between 1/2 inch to a full inch, and that's even without having much muscle on me right now. What I noticed most prominently was that with its increase, the difference between my flexed and unflexed diameter of my wrist increase. What that means is that I could flex my wrist diameter much more than I could when I was younger. I attribute that to be an increase in the diameter of the tendons and connective tissue that are held in the wrist. Next, we should mention that this can happen both pathologically and in a helpful way naturally. So for example, in pathologic circumstances, damage to someone's joints, either through the normal wear and tear or through the immune system's action, causes a resulting immune system overreaction that then degrades the joint. So among arthritics, they have sometimes larger joints, actually most often, they have larger joints, but those joints may be less functionally useful. They don't have the same physiologic integrity that they once did, usually due to the deposition of scar tissue and the removal of helpful chondrocytes and osteoblasts that develop collagen and bone material respectively. Now, it's difficult to show that there are adaptations that are not pathologic in response to stress that increase the joint size. But I've seen this in my discussions with surgeons who have actually opened up people's hands, for example. Recently, I made the acquaintance of a hand surgeon specialist in Los Angeles, and I privately interviewed him about his experience performing hand surgeries on climbers. Climbers, if you've noticed, have some of the thickest fingers of all, and their fingers develop thickness over years of climbing. I anticipated that they may have some kind of pathologic reaction to climbing, like a deposition of scar tissue around the finger joints or in the fingers. It turns out that many of them don't. This hand surgeon told me to my surprise that he had never noticed any pathologic changes to the hands of climbers, but upon opening the hands of climbers, he did notice hypertrophied connective tissue, muscle, and bone. Now, what are the mechanisms at play? As we already mentioned, there's a pathologic reaction from the immune system. But naturally, if you have a strain on either bone or connective tissue, it provides a stimulus to chondrocytes for the connective tissue. Those are cells that synthesize collagen, and osteoblasts, the cells that build up bone, to activity. Now, If that kind of same stimulus was given in certain pathologic conditions, it would have stimulated osteoclasts. The activity of these chondrocytes and osteoblasts increases with the availability of growth factors in our bodies, such that when we're younger, we have more growth factors and are more likely to develop non-pathologic reactions to these stimuli. In fact, there's other reasons that as we get older, our reactions may be more pathologic, including epigenetic changes that occur through our lifetimes. But there is a reason to think that normal, non-pathologic adaptation happens from tension on bones or connective tissue. For example, it's known that among weightlifters, their bones weigh more than non-weightlifters. This is a non-pathologic adaptation to the stress given to those bones. In fact, growth factors are not the only reason that younger people experience less of this pathologic adaptation than older people. Other reasons include epigenetic changes over time. But in the end, the amount of growth factors you have available to you in your body, as well as your mineral status and vitamin status, for example, if you're deficient in magnesium or calcium, you will have more pathologic adaptations to these stimuli. If you're deficient in vitamin D, you'll also have more pathologic adaptations to these stimuli. And if you're systemically inflamed, you'll also have more pathologic adaptations. So certain things qualify how you'll adapt to these stimuli on bone and connective tissue. Finally, I'd like to bring up the point of natural people versus enhanced people reacting to the same stimuli. So it is clear that natural people also have this kind of adaptation to stressful stimuli to the bone and connective tissue. For example, natural people have heavier bones when they weightlift as compared to natural people who don't weightlift. In fact, I just thought of another example. I once interviewed John Wayne Parr, who is a famous Muay Thai champion from Australia. He told me that scans revealed that his shins had increased calcification that was not pathologic to their function. So this certainly does happen in natural people. But in people that are enhanced, it can happen at a much greater, more rapid pace. For example, androgens, that means testosterone and male hormones in general, their effect on the androgen receptor increases the development of bone tissue in the body directly. So does estrogen signaling. So somebody that's on steroids that has higher estrogen and testosterone levels will build bone specifically at a much more rapid pace than someone who isn't on those steroids. Similar things will happen with growth hormone and IGF-1 signaling. And there are other drugs that can specifically increase the synthesis of connective tissue and decrease the likelihood that that connective tissue develops in a pathologic fashion from inflammation and other factors. For example, pentosan polysulfate, which I have a comprehensive video on. In the end, what I'm trying to say here is that it is certainly the case that people can have thickened wrists from training, from that stimulus over time. The amount that their wrists thicken and the way in which they thicken will depend on their mineral status, growth factor availability, and systemic inflammation levels. And people who are on PEDs will most likely experience the most thickening of their wrists, such that younger people specifically that are on PEDs, like somebody like Levan, who was in his early 20s when he began using large growth systems like the growth hormone pathway and IGF-1, should experience the most thickening of their wrists. I hope this was helpful for you, Pradeep. I look forward to seeing you and Artem again on my biohacking and arm wrestling podcast once it starts again. See you soon.